It's 1 o'clock, so it is time to start the Finding Your Own Damn Way episode. We're on the Beaver Network, and we have this show every Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Our idea here is to help people navigate the political landscape, to understand our political systems, to see things through a systems lens is one of the big focuses of conversation, or, how our show is directed. And we offer a platform for people to come on in an uninterrupted opportunity. And then we bring people up for conversation, and we have clarifying questions and people who want to add to the conversation. We're not here to have a lot of chaos, so to speak. We just want educational information, but we have also the election to focus on right now. So we want to make all things conversation about the election, just to be a part of making sure fascism doesn't take over in our country, right? And I want to remind people that we do collect gifts. They go to the hosts to kind of support the emotional work going on here with the Beaver Network. We have subscriptions where people can subscribe and access our Discord for deeper conversations, where you can have video chats, where you can post articles and have your opinion continue to be told. And of course, we do YouTube. So this week, though, on Finding Your Own Damn Way, we have, and correct me if I'm saying this right. So I would say now, to introduce you, Path to Where? Mm-hmm. Like, that's kind of your stitch, right? And I think that's very, very creative. And I want to introduce you, as I did in the TikTok promo, that you come to us with a background in engineering, and that your conversation around economics and your interest in Canadian politics very much through a lens of the training you took with your engineering that you share with economics, and the conversation around, math, as you put it, and how you look at trends and patterns. I'm a social worker. My background's in social work, and I worked with victims of domestic violence and served on committees with some of the most horrendous people offending. And we always looked, and our training was to look for patterns, to look for trends, to look for those things so that we could protect the greater society. So I thought that was interesting. That thought triggered for me when kind of learning about who you were. So with no further ado, because it's 1:03 now, I'd like to start the conversation with you. First, I want to move you over to be like, I'm not sure how, again, my tech thing. I want you to be front and center here. So I want to try to change the screen here. Just bear with me. I think like this. Nope, that didn't work. It was the opposite of what I wanted to do. So that's great, eh? Let me try again. Let's do this. And then what will happen is
Yeah, this is why I don't like this system, because you have to keep moving stuff around to get it to work. It's a bit silly.
Yeah, I should be able to just pop on you and move you into the big screen here.
Yeah.
I've actually done it before, but it doesn't seem to... There you go. I did it. I freaking did it. Woohoo! Sorry, that was painful. So I know. So my question to you, and how I'd like to get the conversation going is, you talked about having what you called a convergent risk index when it came to your conversations about what was happening with the U.S. economy. And I thought if you could just explain that a little bit more, we could start the conversation there, and then we'll just see where it takes us.
Yeah, so this branches out of like systemic risk theory. So what you're doing is whatever environment you're in, you're looking at what are all the contributing factors to success and failure of whatever it is you're doing. So in engineering, and actually everything in life, we should be actually utilizing this type of modeling where we're going, okay, like for instance, like I do woodworking as well, right? So it'd be like, I need to build a table. What is going to contribute to the success or failure of building this table? Like wood type, grain structure, grain direction, the expansion qualities of wood, whether you're mixing woods together, what type of joinery you're using, what type of fasteners you're using, whether you're making it so it's able to be disassembled or gluing it together. So you look at all these factors and where you try to identify every single failure point, and every single contributing element that's going to lead to success. So we do this in engineering. You do it in most sciences, but in the field that I come from, because I work right now primarily with large yachts, which is they're very system heavy, and they're very, very difficult in terms of system integration. So you have to have a compounding layers of systems on top of each other that have to work in coordination. And quite often there's a lot of unforeseen failure points, not just in structure, but in design, in application, in terms of how you're actually going to physically run things, because quite often they will run something and then someone else comes in later and wrecks it, which actually happens in construction as well. So like, for example, newly built boat where someone put a screw through a pipe and through one of the hydraulic lines of steering, and all of a sudden they had a steering failure because someone in the design element of it didn't think to themselves going, okay, well, we're going to have to put panels over this, and there's going to be a screw going through this panel at some point. We got to make sure that these points are identified so we don't put a screw through the wrong area. And then we found this, and I've done this with several applications where I found one fault and reported that fault in a full report format of what happened, and they find that the whole fleet ends up with this problem because there was a design failure because people weren't communicating with each other.
Recall.
Yeah, exactly. And so like I have like with several manufacturers, I've done this, and so because of that, I now part of my role is actually being an expert witness in court cases for this field, because I'll go in and I'll do an analysis. I'll look at all of the failure. I'll look at the installation. I'll look at what processes were done. And so even one thing came down to questioning a factory whether or not they used a torque wrench on something, because the figure that was in the instruction manual was wrong and it was too high and it actually caused damage. And we pointed out that they couldn't have possibly been using the correct tools, because if they had, they would have created damage and that would have been visible. So it came down to that they were installing things incorrectly. They weren't following the manual. They weren't using the correct procedures. And if they had, the person who actually supplied the part would have known earlier, because they would have had all of them fail. So again, it's systemic failure. And I had to go through and do a full report on this, because this is like thousands or millions of dollars when we do the repairs.
Right.
So this is something that I started doing with the first Trump administration, specifically around the economics and the psychology, because from both my parents were in the mental health field, so I actually have a fairly well-versed background in psychology, because I grew up around patients. They lived in our home, so I actually had to learn the basics of most psychology when I was quite young, when I was 4 years old on. So that became something that I always was well-versed in, and that was actually going to be my next field of study. After all of this started happening, I decided probably best not to actually jump into a whole bunch of expensive schooling right now. As the way that everything is going, we're looking at a very likely systemic failure in the United States. And the reason I started doing the Convergent Risk Index, which is basically a subset of taking systemic risk failure and then trying to quantify all of the micro and macro contributing factors that go into the success or failure of a nation. And the problem with most economic modeling is it doesn't take too much psychology into play. And if you go look at all the economic modeling and theories, not a single one of them applies perfectly to the United States. Quite often there's a couple points. So if they have 8 points, there's 2 points that don't fit. Or there's percentages that they've exceeded that doesn't fit, because the modeling's saying if they go beyond this point, they're in failure, but they've already gone beyond that point. So you're going, okay, so when is the real point of failure? Because clearly the theory didn't work, because they're already theorizing that the US should have failed. So getting into terms of quantifying that outside of normal economic modeling, because there's a lot more going into it than just numbers in particular. So it was creating an entire spreadsheet of economic principles, finding out where there's convergent points of failure. So like no one points when the currency drops below 50% as a reserve status. That's considered an economic turning point, and a psychological turning point as well. And that's noted in the theories. It's a psychological turning point.
Could you say that again? The what's known as that turning point?
So the reserve currency status. So when it drops below 50%, that's considered a psychological and economic turning point, because they're no longer the majority shareholders of transactions around the world.
Oh.
They're at 57% now. And Trump's last term, he dropped them 6.5 percentage points. Not percentage points. So he actually dropped down 6.5% off of that. So this term, given the extra volatility, it's very foreseeable he's going to drop it below that 50% margin.
This
And
is
especially with BRICS now finding a solution around the US currency, which they've been doing for several years now, they're also accelerating that decline. And you can actually see in the modeling or in the numbers the drop in percentage in Trump. And then in Biden, it completely leveled off. He only lost like a half or 1%, where Trump lost 6.5%. So we can then use projections going forwards. And this isn't a linear model situation anymore. Like even Congress comes out with their action plans, and they did denote in 2023 and 2024 that they know by 2035 the personal debt to GDP ratio will be over 115%, which is a critical point. But the reality is, it's not just the personal debt; it's also governmental debt, because federal specifically are the ones who are, providing all the services for everyone. So if they can't pay their bills, that's more important than if the people can't pay their bills.
And I like what you said, the psychological kind of pivot point too. Our another Beaver, Frontline Feminist, I'm sure you're familiar with her and her shows here. She makes a conversation in one of her videos about how these ideological economic systems like socialism, like capitalism, like Marxism, they don't take into account that when the cycle comes into power, when that narcissist wants to take that system and tear it apart,
Yeah.
it's like this is an ideological system in its perfect form could do this, but it's without the faults of these players. And so I'm really happy to hear this piece of conversation. I think that's interesting.
And this is the thing: the trend the U.S. is on is unsustainable. Almost every economist will come out and say that. There's a good like about 4-hour interview with a Yale economist. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but I can probably post it later on. And he's talking about how this is the downfall of the United States, and Donald Trump's effectively packaging it in a good way. The thing is, the projections were like 2035 to 2040 when it became really problematic. But Donald Trump accelerated that in his first term, and he's going to accelerate it in his second term. So it doesn't really matter what party was in power; it was going to happen anyway. Just at what speed is it going to happen?
Okay.
And that's the thing, and it's just a simple numbers problem, right? Because they're increasing debt. They're not decreasing spending. Their interest rate is 20% of their income, right? So 20% of the government income, the federal income, goes to just paying interest, which is a huge problem. Can you imagine having like a paycheck that's $100 and you actually have to pay a bill that's $120, and right off the bat $20 is gone. So now you got to go get a payday loan effectively for $40,
Right.
right? And that's effectively what the U.S. system is under right now, and even their GDP growth is sustained simply because of the borrowing. So if they were not borrowing basically $1 trillion a year, their GDP would be less than that of growth, would be less than Canada. Mm-hmm. And this shows you the very big disparity between how governments run. So Canada, we don't typically run a very large deficit, if any at all. Or quite often, whatever we take in is what we spend, more or less, maybe 50 billion here or there, which isn't big in the greater picture of things. But when you look at the US, when it's like they're rolling over additional 20% every single year on top of what their budget is, that's massive, right? And that's why it's unsustainable, because they are going to hit a point where it's like, where are they going to pull money from? Especially when you have bondholders that are willing to divest themselves, like China could very easily divest themselves from their bonds and completely tank the U.S. bond market. Because they are, the U.S. is at their debt ceiling. They technically breached their debt ceiling, which I think they've only done once before. They're in extraordinary measures right now. So they're not allowed to issue new debt. All they can do is roll over existing debt, which is $7.8 trillion, and they can issue just enough money for the government to keep functioning. But they can't now issue new bonds to raise new funds until that debt ceiling is raised, which they're now going to have to raise it by quite a lot to catch up. And it becomes compounding. And a lot of the economic modeling is linear. It's not progressive. It doesn't use any logarithmic curves, because historically we do see relatively linear progression. But under Trump, we didn't see that, right? So we have these models where they're going nice and linear, and all of a sudden they spike up, and then they level off again when he's gone. And it really is a problematic thing, because it becomes a point where Congress, when they're actually putting out their data, can't put out accurate data because it's a political problem, for one. And secondly, they can only forecast what they think is going to happen based off linear modeling, and they tend to publish the worst, or publish the least detrimental scenario in their numbers, but then they warn about the worst case. right? And realistically, we're somewhere in between, in the middle to the higher end of that spectrum of what they predict.
And I suppose that psychological fear really expresses itself every time you have these urgent meetings in Congress to increase the debt ceiling, and they'll hold them hostage. They're going to shut down government. People are going to lose their jobs. There's going to be layoffs because we're going to freeze the government till we figure out this debt ceiling fee, right? And did not Trump try to just have something passed right when he first, like on his first day kind of thing, have something passed so there'd be an unlimited debt ceiling, and actually that didn't go forward?
No.
Is that correct?
Yeah. So like this is where the Project 2025 and Mar-a-Lago Accord come into play. Because if you actually look at all their executive orders, you can parallel them to every single part of those two documents. So they're following it. And it's kind of weird because it's a combination of Trump, of course, he's trying to stay out of jail. He's trying to stay out of trouble. So is Musk, for that matter. Yes. And they're cooperating with all of this, of course, because it's in their best interest at this point. Because reality-wise is Trump wants to create some sort of authoritarian environment where he's protected if he decides to leave office, if he ever leaves office. But he's already, of course, trying to extend term limits. And then in that case, Project 2025, the whole point of that is to consolidate power to the executive branch, which is outside of what the democratic rules of the United States are supposed to be. And then all of the trade and finance is coming from the Mar-a-Lago Accord. And they are following suit with it. And the problem is, on a theory-based level, it is correct in what you would need to do to make the U.S. into a more stable economy, meaning be able to decline that debt and take it away. The problem is it's something that you have to implement over 40, 80, or 100 years, which is why they're saying these 50 to 100-year bonds. They know it's going to take an incredibly long time to do, but they're trying to do it in a very short period of time and force everyone to cooperate. And this is why we're seeing these actions with these tariffs. We will likely see them actually demand kickbacks from countries for them selling goods to the United States, so that they can reduce their debt. I mean, they have a situation where they have to cut or effectively change their spending by $3 trillion a year for 40 years to recover from the debt, which the problem with that is the psychology. People aren't going to accept the cuts that are necessary. So the income tax across the board would have to be like 60% to be able to make those kind of changes. The military would have to be reduced by 1/3. Social services would effectively be gone. The healthcare system would effectively be pay to play completely system. And it would create massive joblessness. And what that would do is crash the job market, because all of a sudden competition for jobs would be very, very high. People would be willing to work for a lot less money. That would make it more attractive for corporations to come back. So devaluing the American population in trade-off for bringing back manufacturing. Yes.
Arg!
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's what the Mar-a-Lago Accord effectively wants to do. They want to devalue the dollar without losing the global currency reserve status, so they maintain power, which those two things are in conflict with each other, which is why fundamentally there's a lot of problems with that plan, and especially if you're trying to do it very quickly. But realistically, the U.S. doesn't have the money to keep incentivizing companies to stay. Like I think they paid Tesla $500 million effectively to stay in the country, to keep manufacturing in the U.S., and they can't keep doing that. So they have to make it attractive some way, one way or the other. And I believe John Deere and Ford already said they're not cooperating. They're still going out of the country. So that just shows you that major corporations understand the economics behind it, and they're not paying attention. They're not listening because they know it's wrong. They know it's going to create a problem, and they're hedging their bets, and they're getting the resources out, right? They know the damage it's going to cause.
So who's going to benefit overall from this big plan? When you say like the Mar-a-Lago Accord and is it just a few choice billionaires like that, or like where are the billionaires?
Nobody. That's the thing, is nobody will actually benefit from it realistically, because even the billionaires are going to lose money, right? They're not going to suffer greatly, but they're going to lose money, because if you devalue a population and what they have to spend, where are you going to get your money for your business from? Where are they going to be buying your goods? Are they going to be going out shopping at Lululemon, right? Less likely, because they're not going to spend $100 on leggings when they go to Walmart for $20, because they just don't have the money to do it. So a good example is like they're trying to basically pay everyone less, but how are you going to cut your costs? how are you going to make the cost of living less in a really rapid amount of time to accommodate for that? It's just not possible. So they always complain about China being unfair because they pay their people low wages. And it's like, well, yeah, someone in China on average can make $15,000 a year. That's kind of the median salary, except their cost of living is 60% less. So they can afford to do that because their cost of living is so much lower. It's not because they're paying their people a ridiculously low wage. It's just that their cost of living is that much less. And because of that, they've actually been able to build their middle class rather rapidly over the last 20 years, or 30 years actually. Where the U.S., they have the opposite situation. They want to, devalue the population, but still keep profits high. Those are, two counterproductive things.
When you look at these realities, I'm going to ask you the question: do you think Canada's broken?
No, we fundamentally operate very differently from the U.S. So, if I remember correctly, our GDP for last year was like 2.1 trillion. And our debt's like 1.5 trillion. We have like a 60% GDP to debt ratio. So that's actually not bad. That's in terms of G7s, that's not bad at all. The best one is Germany. They're net positive technically. So the US right now is 124%. They're double what we are basically. And people don't look at those numbers because of what you'll see a number from Canada posted as, 110 or 102% GDP to debt ratio, but that's combining government and personal. If you combine government and personal in the U.S., it's like 170%. So it's really problematic for the U.S. For Canada, all of our debt's relatively manageable, primarily because most of our income is resource-based, right? So, and we have a good ability to capitalize on resources in the future, where the United States is running out. They say, they have $33 trillion in natural resources, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 11 trillion of that is in coal. It's like, okay, but no one's using coal anymore. And how are you going to convince people to use coal? So that $11 trillion doesn't matter. Now Canada is in the lead for natural resources because the resources that we have are being utilized around the world and will continue to be. Because as much as people don't like oil and gas, it's in 90% of what we have in our houses. We can't get rid of using it. There just aren't substitutes yet. But the best thing we can do is reduce our reliance on it, meaning just reduce the consumption because it is a finite resource. We only have so much of it before it's gone, right? It was all created in roughly the same geological time period. We're not going to have it happen again. It's not like a tree that we can grow back. So we have to be conscious that, we have to look forward, not just, 10 years, 100 years, 200 years. Because when we have all these products that are reliant on that resource, how do we make it so we don't run out of that?
And, that's what I find missing in today's political conversation is that macro kind of big futuristic goals. And the last person I really seen that emoted that was Pierre Elliott Trudeau, quite frankly. When he talked about, the energy and how to unite across Canada and stabilize Canada domestically through the Petro-Canada, that whole Crown Corporation and everything. That to me was one of the last big kind of examples of the long-term goal. And then I see how it got eroded over the last 30 years to the point where, we're in this kind of crisis because of what was happening with the threat of the tariffs and the way our pipeline system takes an exit stage right down into the United States before coming back up into feeding Eastern Canada. And a lot had to do, and I know Canada had choices to make back then, in order for the pipeline to go through Quebec, if I'm not mistaken. Quebec's demand was to have the pipeline wanted a refinery on the sort of like oceanfront property along the Great Lakes, and Quebec said no, we're not doing that, and so they worked around it, and that's how the pipeline went south. But now they have to revisit that. We have to revisit that idea, right?
Yeah, and part of the issue with that, of course, is the U.S. government pressured Canada to get rid of our crown corporations. And that was for obvious reasons to their benefit. There was something else I could touch on that. Oh my goodness, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, but the people forget too that the demand, the growth in our oil and gas sector was entirely because of the U.S. Because they didn't want to work with the Saudis anymore. They didn't want to work with OPEC because they were getting 60% of their resources from OPEC, and they went, "This is not a good idea when we don't trust them." right? So they went to Canada, of course, and said, let's start importing it from Canada instead. So we went from a 15% share to a 60% share, right, in their market. Oh, you guys, playing in the background. Ellie?
I'll take this opportunity just to kind of do a pause here and remind people that we're on the Beaver Network with Finding Your Own Damn Way, and that we have some gift goals, and appreciate any support that goes to the hosts here that put the emotional work into these shows. Remind people that we have subscriptions down below, right by the little circles there. Get you all kinds of cool emojis, by the way, and it gets you access to our Discord where we have deeper conversations. And we're on YouTube now, so you'll all be celebrated permanently on our YouTube channel. Go and check it out. It's a half hour into the conversation thereabout, and I'm hoping we can bring Women Against Polyev. Good timing on the video. I was just going to invite you in on the conversation. And yeah, so that's great. So would you like to say anything at this time? Or is it okay past there to invite her in at this moment?
Yeah, I just have, nice to meet you, Path. I'm Fran from Vancouver. I just want to comment on a question if I can. Comment being, I have always been a huge political person in my life, but I don't have an economics brain. And so I've been following you, and I'm starting to make my way through your Substack articles. I just got a project this week that I'm working on, so next week I'll have the time to really go through it. Just for me, that takes some time, and I so appreciate what you've been saying and your context. The information, but also the context around what's going to happen with the Americans, and also how Canada will be able to withstand that. And my question to you is, do you have any comments, given that we're in this election, around how you see the Liberal Party, should they form, when they form government, majority of course, dealing with the American situation, given Carney's expertise and sort of their ideology versus, say, if God forbid we get a Polyev government? How do you see you have been handling that differently? I don't think I've heard you talk about that, and I'm curious, given that we are in the election.
Yeah. So I haven't covered this yet because it's quite an expansive topic. But one easy way to point this out is Carney did an interview with, I think it was George Stroumboulopoulos like 10 years ago or so. And he was already talking about how Canada should be divesting out of the U.S. economy, how we should become more globalized. And so he's been aware of this, probably since he was with the Bank of Canada, maybe before that, where he knows how dangerous it is to be reliant on only one trading partner. And so he's already had the mindset for, who knows, 2 decades that we need to be divesting out of the United States and then shifting our resources overseas. And that's actually not particularly difficult for us to do, with exception of oil and gas, just because of the volume of oil and gas that we do. So getting all of that volume onto ships would be rather difficult. However, everything else is entirely doable. It's a total of about 7 ships a day. And we already currently have about 100 to 110 ships a day going in and out of our ports. We have the capacity to add 7 ships. It wouldn't be a problem. We have the terminal capacity for it. So actually doing that logistically is not particularly difficult. That just requires trade deals and some hiring of transport. Where Pierre Polyev, he was there under the Harper government, and I had some really strong criticisms of the Harper government in terms of waterway deregulation. Because here in BC, as you know, we had the microhydro plant explosion where everyone went to all the little rivers and creeks so they could and create microhydro power plants on it. Well, I worked for someone who was actually building one of those, and they've never made money on it because they don't produce power in a time of year when we need it. They're producing it in March, April, May, and then by June, most of the snowmelt that they're utilizing for the flow is gone, and they have to divert the water because they can't completely suck up a stream, and they just don't end up producing power when they need it. So, the power going down to California isn't being sold. The stuff that they're doing isn't being sold at a profitable price, so there's no point in doing it. In the meantime, we've blocked off a ton of streams and habitats and made a bunch of basically footprint damage and have this infrastructure that's effectively going to be useless at one point because there won't be a point in maintaining it if it's not profitable, right? So we'll end up with the Alberta oil field population. You'll have these companies, divest themselves. Quite often they'll pull all the assets out of the company and let it go bankrupt so they don't have any responsibility.
Does that include the Site C dam?
Site C dam is a big different, so that all started because of that. But that's a different story. That won't ever close. That will be profitable because it's not a microhydro. These microhydro plants, what they do is they find a small stream with a very large vertical change over a short distance, and they use the column pressure
the head of pressure to create power, where the Site C dam is using a massive volume of water over a shorter elevation to be able to produce the power.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Pat, do you see any, and again, I'm extreme in my anti-conservative views, political views, but do you see any competence or bench strength in the conservative MPs that we have now or in the machine that would be able to deal with what Trump is doing? Like anything at all? Okay, good.
There just isn't, and like
Not good, but
it's very like easy to quantify that, because if you look at going someone, okay, so let's just say Pierre Poilievre. That's the one who everyone focuses on. He's been in it for 20 years. If you were in any other job and performed as he did, you would have been fired years ago, because he's never done anything legislative wise, which is primarily what they're there for. He has primarily voted in the interest of deregulating businesses, corporations, and not in the type of deregulation that is going to be a benefit and not a detriment. He really doesn't define those two things. So, good example, Liberal government actually here in BC, they deregulated some mining regulations, and we ended up with a Mount Polley mine disaster, right? That was because of deregulation. And this is why I tell people, I'm not a Liberal or NDP or Conservative supporter. I'm supporting whoever actually has the skills and the policy to do the right thing. So, Pierre has never been able to pull off anything effectively successfly. And the easiest demonstration of this, if you go to conservative.ca/plan, it's a survey. Because they don't, again, they have policies, but no plans behind the policy. And this is clear. And every time he talks, it's clear. Every single time you look at their page, there's no updates that end up with actually any implementation plans. And if you can't do that on a basic level to show your supporters, how are you going to do it in government, right? If you can't come up with a basic actual policy outline, what are you going to do in terms of actually implementing something? And the reality is what Pierre wants to do is deregulate across the board, not just deregulate, at the start of a project saying, let's cut the red tape and then that's it. We'll just cut red tape. No, we'll cut red tape and then it's too costly to do monitoring during the process of mining. It's too costly to have mine inspectors going in, all these things, oil and gas inspectors, building inspectors. He wants to cut back on all of that generally, all the regulation to make it cheaper for companies.
Last night, myself and Mrs. Radical covered the Mossy Side show, and I talked about this regulation problem with the Conservative plan, because they were in Petty Harbour, Newfoundland, and Petty Harbour is next to Maddox Cove, and they're very specially protected water for small fishermen to fish closer to shore. And he had a news conference where he was toting his Conservative candidate with a bust in 30 people that are not from that community. And he said he's going to deregulate those waters. And I just happen to have a husband from that community. And we're like, oh, no, you're not. There's been a plan in place and a regulation for 100 years to protect those waters. And to go down there and just boldly make those friggin' statements as if that regulation and the threat of that doesn't have some kind of psychological impact on the people that live in that community.
Yeah. And so further on that base, he's generally pushing pro-capitalism in terms of major corporations, not the small businesses. And that's where it becomes problematic. Harper did the same thing. And this is what ends up happening is the largest corporations come and take advantage of it, and the medium and smaller businesses don't get any benefit. So it ends up just more than often than not bringing in U.S. businesses that are here. They profit off of it and they head out. Which oil and gas sector, good example of that, right? Canadians aren't on a whole making a lot from the oil and gas sector. That's in Alberta, BC, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, Labrador. It's all over Canada. It's not just Alberta, but it's almost always U.S. companies benefiting from it.
I seen a TikTok where Alberta actually gets more money from transfer payments than they do from the oil and gas in revenues coming into their province, right? So they're what would be considered to have no province, right?
What we pay in taxes is almost the same as what BC pays in taxes. And we're not complaining about no equalization payments, right? Actually, if you looked at 2022, we contributed $30 billion to the tax dollars, and they contributed less than we did. Our GDPs are almost parallel now, and we will actually exceed their GDP relatively shortly on the trend that we're going, because BC is constantly going up, and they're kind of up and down, up and down, up and down.
Do you think it is a worse ride for Canada to respond up and down the way Trump is. Okay, tariffs today, no tariffs tomorrow. Right now, there's a 90-day pause. That could change tomorrow.
Yeah.
You know, I like the steady course of action with the plan that Mark Carney lays out.
Yeah.
And I have suddenly come in touch with the fact of how I've always said Canada is not broken, but I never really understood the dynamics of that till of late. And I have much more confidence in our ability to ride what could be a recession, is my understanding, coming towards Canada, but that we have the ability to ride it out because of our new partnerships being developed and the way, you know, like you were saying, that GDP debt ratio.
Yeah, we still have room to borrow. That's one thing that's important to realize. Like Canada effectively still has a good margin that we can still borrow on. And the US doesn't really, even though they still manage to do it, they technically don't have a margin to borrow on anymore. They're over leveraged by a long shot. So in terms of international borrowing, we can do that. In terms of bringing in international investment, we can still do that because it's still an attractive economy, because we've generally steadily grown about 1.7% GDP year over year, because we don't pump extra into our economy to boost that. Where the US basically does. They usually beat us out by a percentage point or two, but that's because they're overspending every single year to boost their economy. There's a trade multiplier in that. And so for us staying steady, especially on like the tariffs and stuff like that, we're just saying we're putting them on and then we're leaving them on until it's all over with, is actually the best thing to do, because it allows consumers to adapt. And as soon as consumers adapt, there's actually been studies done on this. It takes only about 2 or 3 weeks of them to go find a new product and then become loyal to that product. And even if that product comes back on the market, they won't go back to it. There's like a 95% retention rate. So keeping it on allows Canadians to adapt. And then even if we do drop them, it still inflicts damage in the long run.
So, I know a lot of people look at debt the way we look at our personal debt, and that, you know, we're going to, you know, die eventually. And so our debts have to be wrapped up and shored up and everything. But our country's never going to go through that experience.
No. And all of the debt problems in Canada are tied directly to the mortgage market. If you look at the trends, they're tied directly to mortgages. All of our increase in debt has been tied to mortgages. And that's basically it. So if you look at the year-over-year increase, it goes parallel to the housing market. It's like dead on. Those two lines follow each other exactly. So our debt is mainly held, like the majority of our debt is held in an asset. And Canada housing has always been an asset and has always increased because Canada is a nice place to live. It's a relatively stable economy. We don't have major ups and downs in our economy. We're not seen as a threatening nation. We're considered a friendly nation. Everyone knows this around the world, and that's why it's an attractive place to live. This is why I've told people, like, I would love it if the housing market burst, because I mean, it would make it affordable for everyone. But the reality is that's not likely to ever happen, because as long as we have an attractive atmosphere to be in, people are going to want to be here. It's as simple as that. It's a supply-demand kind of thing. We're supplying a very, very nice place to live. There is a high demand for that, which is why we're more stable. Because even though we're over-leveraged on debt right now, that debt has been appreciated, right? We have been getting returns on that debt. So we went from, I think it was in the early 90s, from a below 100% debt to personal income to debt ratio, to I think 180% now. So we've slowly increased that over those years. But the US, the interesting thing is they've always held between 160 to 200% personal debt to income ratio. They all have. And this can be seen if you go down there. They all have toys, they have boats, you know, they'll have their vacation place or an RV, and they have all these things. And you're like, wow, they must be doing really, really well because they can afford all these things. It's like, no, those are all purchased on debt, on payment plans, right? So they are over leveraged on depreciating assets primarily. So their housing market hasn't seen the same growth, but yet they haven't had a depreciation in their debt ratio.
Well, I heard some stories about me having a housing bubble burst. How in China, that part of the destabilization in their economic system is a similar housing bubble that's been created that's about to burst.
Actually, a very different structure in how they did that. That was done by way overbuilding.
Okay.
So they built into the future by like 25 years. Like they really, because real estate was perceived as such a safe investment, they went, okay, great, we'll just create a bunch of housing that's a safe investment, and they just did that. And so there's a ton of extra empty housing right now. So they are good for the next 20 years in terms of housing. So even though they over-legislated themselves, they also then secured housing for the future. So it's a bit of it's like, yes, they put themselves at risk, but for a legitimate reason.
Mm-hmm. Can I just ask you two more questions, and I'm going to step down because I'm sure other people will talk to you. But in the United States, when I watch a lot of political and economic commentary from the U.S., obviously, and seems to be this very calm, almost understated approach from economic people there as to what's going to happen, unlike what you and others are saying. Am I correct to see that they understand what you're saying and what's going to happen? And it's okay, good. And then the second thing, I just saw this morning that is it the House passed its framework for the budget, which is this incredible, tax break for the wealthy, cutbacks on Social Security and Medicaid and all of that. Does anything in that change what you said in terms of worsening the prediction, or is that
that's in line? That is in line with what the whole intent of those two projects are. Project 2025 and the Mar-a-Lago Accord, both of them. It parallels perfectly. That you can actually go and look at that Substack paper, and you can know what's going to happen in the next year because of the predictability of what they're following through with.
I'm sending it to everybody I know.
Yeah, the funny thing is, like, they are literally not diverging from those plans. And people are saying it's so unpredictable. It's like, no, actually, if you look at the two plans, I mean, it took 2 months of us observing to see what they were doing with all of the executive orders, and then seeing how they're putting out actions and responding to them to know, okay, they actually are following those plans. This isn't just entirely random. And people were saying that they were following the plans, but you didn't have the predictors, you didn't have the data in place to confirm that, yes, that's what they're doing. But we do now. The tariffs are part of that. It's a strong arm tactic, right? It's not about trade deficit at all. It's them trying to devalue, in a way, gaining money and devaluing their economy at the same time. Right. But it doesn't, and the math, because the math doesn't work on it. If they did keep the tariffs on, they'd only get $500 billion in revenue, so $500 billion, but the taxpayers would actually end up paying $800 billion, and they'd lose $400 billion in GDP. So they'd have a $1.2 billion, $1.3 billion like output for only $500 billion. So $700 billion deficit on that, which they can't afford to do, right?
So basically, with Carney, we're and our resources and all the things you've talked about, Canada is reasonably well positioned if the election goes well to withstand this and move on, and the best for the work from the States of all time. I understand the question.
I'm having a really hard time hearing you.
I apologize. My phone's probably not on. Sorry. My last question, I guess, is from what, if I understand then everything you're saying, is that Canada, if we get a Carney government, is well positioned to be able to evolve from the United States and move through into our new economic transition, new economic reality. Okay, that's good to know. Yeah. That's why I'm saying people, and I'm sharing your papers with everyone. So
yeah, the reality is the U.S. can't afford to stop buying what they're buying from us right now, because they don't have. That's one of the reasons, like, the sanctions aren't on Russia, and why they're trying, or the trade war isn't on Russia, and they're trying to remove sanctions on Russia, because if they can't get trade from Canada, that's the only other place they can get the majority of the resources from. So like potash, that's why it's such a big, like, pushing button, right? Big button on that, because Canada holds the biggest deposit, and then everyone was like, Russia holds the next biggest deposit. They don't actually. The next biggest deposit is Eritrea in Africa.
Oh.
Yeah, and this is only found in 2015, and immediately a Chinese firm got a 50% ownership in that claim, which is why in the same time period, the U.S. launched sanctions on Eritrea. And if you go look up Eritrea, it's a very small country on the strait going up to the Suez Canal, and the U.S. said they needed the sanctions on it because it's a security issue. And also under human rights violations, which we know the U.S. never sanctions anyone under human rights violations. That just doesn't happen. And if you look at it going, well, they've got a military base in Djibouti, which is right next door. They have military agreements with everyone else around them, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So it's like, so clearly they control the whole strait except for Eritrea, but they don't need to. There's nothing in there. There's 3 million people. That's the whole population. They're at war with Ethiopia, right? And then why did the Biden administration continue those sanctions against them? They're going, why would it, apparently a peace-loving democratic government continue sanctions against a country that's destitute? Again, because they were trying to get China to divest. And so they're using this as a security problem because China's there and they're trying to keep Russia from having control, because it's the second largest deposit of potash in the world. And it can supply the U.S. for 120 years.
Wow.
The U.S. only has 22 years of supply themselves.
That's a light bulb moment into this Panama Canal conversation.
Oh,
And I
Panama Canal?
hear that China destabilized the whole movement. I didn't quite understand the depth of that conversation.
So that's the Suez Canal, but the Panama Canal, so Trump lost his hotel there. And so he's trying to punish the government effectively for doing that.
Really?
Yeah, so there was a bunch, so he got sued, they won, some other guy got over it, the government investigated him for tax fraud, surprise, surprise. So he's under investigation for that, which is why he's going after Panama.
I see. Okay.
I just heard today, Pat, that Midas Touch, I believe, that they've actually started moving troops into Panama or near Panama.
Maybe near Panama.
Yeah, it would be near, so who knows what's going to happen there. None of it sounds any good.
Yeah, everybody in the world will stand up against that because that is a national or a international trade corridor, and it's already recognized. So maritime law, there's a lot of maritime law that applies to all of this that is globally recognized by all the countries that sign on the IMO. So International Marine Organization, it's like 201 or 206 countries. So all of those countries have vested interest in protecting that agreement, and having the U.S. sit there with military ships is not part of that agreement. Yeah.
I like that comment.
I really appreciate everything you're doing here, because I know you keep saying on your thing that this wasn't your intent on how you want to spend your time, like on TikTok videos, but you do such a great job, and you provide so much information, and thank you so much. It really confirms for me, that who doesn't know much about economics, what I think I know politically, and that's really helpful for me and the people I talk to every single day about all of this. So thank you so much. And I'm sorry I have to go because I'm doing a show.
Just one favor of you before you go. This has been burning on my mind since the conversation last night's show. And if you could just lean into your mic a little bit when you say this. Treaty 6, the conversation about trying to take the higher road when sometimes you respond with maybe not the most politically correct or the most kind way that, the right wing wants us to do. And you said it so succinctly about basically, this morality clause that we're all held to by the right suddenly. Morality's a thing. And the way you explained how you didn't have to, absorb that anyway, I was wondering if you could just say that again.
Yeah, so for me, I don't think that we should feel bad as people, excuse me, in the middle or on the left or progressive, however we define ourselves, anyone that's not right wing. We don't have to apologize for standing up for ourselves, regardless of what we say. I don't see that, for the most part, people like us are personally insulting people or their characteristics. And how we stand up for ourselves is how we stand up for ourselves. And in this moment, we need to do that very vigorously, without apology and without regret. Because if we don't, and we end up where the United States is, we will never get our country back, at least not in my lifetime, or probably our children's lifetime. So we don't have to feel sorry for what we say. We don't have to apologize. We don't have to second guess ourselves. The people that I know, like all of us, they're all smart, they're articulate, they're passionate, and they're doing this because they care about this country and about the people in it and about the future and our land, especially for Indigenous people. So don't apologize. Don't waste your time with that. It's a waste of energy. Move forward and keep spreading the message. You have nothing to feel bad for. Is that sort of what I said last night? Does that capture it? Because I feel really strongly about that. We need to stop doing that. There's a lot of smart people here and out there, and all sorts of people that I know in my personal life who are spreading this message, and keep at it. Don't waste your time apologizing or feeling bad. It doesn't do anything. This moment is too serious. The issues are too serious. And people on the right who fall into this extreme right-wing vortex of shit, as I call it, excuse me, Pat, are people who don't care whether you apologize or feel bad. It doesn't matter to them. So let's just move forward with our messages. So everybody here is articulate, and they're really smart. And keep doing what you do. It's awesome.
All right. Thank you so much for all your time. And
I have to go. I'm so sorry. I have to go and do a show. Mrs. Well, I'm safe managing a show. Pat, thank you very, very much. You're awesome.
All right. We'll see you in face again soon.
Yeah, bye-bye.
And if you're interested, can I invite a few people? We have 60 people in the room. So we want to take advantage of tapping and sharing is caring and get the live and the algorithm moving out there. And now if you want to come up and join the conversation, perhaps you have some burning questions for Path to Where. Who knows where you're going to end up. So we invite you all up. There have been some people trying to come up and I just haven't responded to them. And I'm sorry that, but the conversation just needed to have your focus, right? I think about, 60 people in a room. Sometimes people hang out for only 3 minutes. We may, in the analytics, be told that 3,000 people went through this room. Well, 3,000 people stayed for 3 minutes. That's a lot of education. Because what you were saying is, hopefully they can go and fact check whatever may disturb them. But it's like you can't say you didn't hear it, right? And so they leave with some good pieces to chew on as they go away. So I don't know if you've seen Mark Carney's conversation today. He was making a plan for some of the policy he's going to roll out in terms of crime. And he was very, he had some really good things to say about how he's going to protect children. He said, the fundamental acknowledgement is that parental rights are front and center. The parent is the first place where kids are, taken care of. He said, beyond the parent, our community is responsible. And we are going to protect through legislation. And he talked about having harsher penalties put in place for sharing pornographic content without consent. Right? He was...
my mom actually had to deal with that in schools.
In
schools, and it was almost a daily basis, and it was coming from everywhere. And she was having such a hard, because she was a safe school liaison. And so she was basically, students would come to you, we have a problem, and she was the liaison between the students and administration, and she saw that on a regular basis. That was an actual problem. Yeah. Yeah,
isn't that something, right? And so
that was 10 years ago.
Online predators, right? Sometimes they like that piece of conversation. But, and he talked about women's issues, and he talked about, he talked about putting more experiencing domestic violence. Somebody's able to give us a sound. I'm not doing that. I don't know how that's happening. I think it comes with one of the gifts. Thank you for whoever gave the gift, of course. And I just thought, I wonder how the right wing is going to manipulate this conversation. How they're going to say that they're going, the regulations are going to be an overstepping control. And I'm waiting for this piece to be a culture war piece somehow. I just heard the conversation in his a piece of his speech this morning.
We would have to see
I have to prove I'm a robot here. I'm not a robot here. Hang on.
We'd have to see when that policy comes out. I'm curious to see what type of implementation or what they're going to do for that, because you can have an argument for like restricting freedom of speech or monitoring, like the Big Brother kind of stuff being a concern. But I'd be curious to see how they're going to do that. That's a big picture type of thing.
It is a big picture kind of thing, and how can with working in women's issues, and recognizing that there really isn't a lot of protection for women in our criminal justice system, and how difficult it is to go through an actual process like that.
Yeah, because the system is designed to be gender unbiased, which isn't really what we need.
No, we need to have equity in our system, right? That needs to be built in.
Because we have to recognize that, men and women on a legal basis have different challenges.
Absolutely. I'm just going through the list here to see if I can invite some people up into the conversation.
Yeah, because there is bias, not even just bias gender of people who are facing legal challenges, but people who are then determining the outcome. There is gender bias in that as well, and that's been identified in the criminal court system several times.
So, part for me of why gender bias is so heavily, sort of soundly established in our system has to do with the amount of Supreme Court judges that have been appointed across Canada. What do you know, or if you know anything about when Harper changed the appointee committee in order to get Supreme Court judges nominated and placed, and he put in RCMP representation and he put in more representation from the criminal justice point of view. That committee had a breadth of professionals at the table, so that you would have a breadth of industries informing, right?
Yeah.
Informing. It wasn't just going to be lawyers. It wasn't just going to be RCMP officers, but he managed to change the system. And he actually, my understanding is he appointed 600 of the 800 federal Supreme Court judges that we have in Canada. And that was that happened over his 9-year stint in power. And I first came in touch with that information when I seen what Trump did with the Supreme Court in the United States, and I thought we better be careful here in Canada that doesn't happen to us. And then it turned out it did happen to us, and then Trump was just taking somebody else's idea.
I'm not particularly familiar on that, but I'd be interested to see what got put on the panel, because that kind of goes in line with proportional representation by the sounds of it. Because, yeah, if you just have a panel of lawyers, I mean, anybody who's ever worked with lawyers are typically fairly strict in terms of only looking at what's on the paper and not outside of that in terms of psychology, in terms of actual social, economic issues, in terms of psychological issues that the country faces. Because, like, both my parents have been in mental health. I went through the time period where we watched Woodlands and Riverview get closed here in Vancouver, and the mental health problems spike, and therefore the crime problems spike, because all of a sudden there's all these people on the street that don't know how to manage themselves in life, and they turn to drugs. And that really wasn't ever part of the plan in terms of our legislation and dealing with criminal code changes. And so I would be interested to see who was on that panel, because I would suspect he didn't appoint them personally. I would suspect they probably had a collaboration on who's needed in that field. But I'd be actually curious to see who actually got put on that panel.
He was actually, there was somebody, I think it was Audrey McKinnon, went and she had a big fight with him in Parliament about doing this, about changing the structure of who nominates and who appoints the judges. And he kind of just made it the committee heavy in terms of that crackdown. And then it makes you wonder, because the whole platform for, I call him Tiny Trump here in Canada, what does he run on? Getting tough on crime, the catch and release and all these kind of things, and the misleading around that propaganda piece. Maybe you could.
So Pierre, if you actually look at his platform, it is Harper 2.0. It's the same platform, it's just updated. And that's a problem too. Is like I had a discussion yesterday. Some guy came on and saying, we need to deregulate the oil fields, and then the criminal justice system is harsh enough, and we need to bring back the death penalty. Why? Like, every single first world nation has done studies on it, showing that the crackdown on crime, being harder on crime and capital punishment, doesn't work. It exasperates the situation. It makes everything worse. And then if you look at countries like, I can't remember if it's Norway, Finland, or Sweden, or Denmark, one of those countries made it illegal to make someone a criminal. And the reason for that is a lot of people that were getting criminal records were destitute. They were people who were desperate, right? And so they turned to crime as a result of that. And then what happens? They had a criminal record, so they couldn't get a good job, so the cycle just perpetuated itself. And that's the same case with mental health issues, right? Why are you going to criminalize someone with a mental health issue? Because they couldn't get support, right? And people say, well, it's a choice. It's like, it is and it isn't a choice. Myself I'm like on the spectrum, I'm ADHD, I don't have a choice in that. I don't get much sleep a lot of the times because my brain will not shut off. And the solution to that is often medication or severe exercise, like really, really heavy exercise, so that I can actually exhaust myself. These aren't choices that I have in my life. And there are plenty of people in their lives don't have choices over how they can control themselves mentally. And often that is done through medication. It is done through counseling. And when these resources aren't available to them, and they end up in a criminal situation and they get criminalized, you're not improving your life in any way. You're perpetuating a cycle that they are stuck in, right? So getting harder on that doesn't help. It never has. And more often than not, when we see those activities, it's a mental health issue. It's not necessarily criminal activity. Yes, there are some people who are, they have a particular mindset. So like psychopaths, we know this, they're problematic because it's effectively a genetic structure of the brain. It's a genetic thing versus like a sociopath where that's trained into a person. So you can deprogram that, right? So we know there's certain things we can't do anything about, but majority of them we can. So why are we going to say this person is less valuable? We're going to criminalize them and make their life worse for the rest of their life, when we could have initially dealt with the mental health crisis, solved this. Now that we haven't done it, we can't just then blame them. We have to then step back and go, where do we go wrong? Where do we make the correction? How do we implement changes so this doesn't persist? And having capital punishment doesn't resolve any of that, right? And then someone was like, well, what about Ecuador? It's like, Ecuador is a first world nation that just started killing off a whole bunch of their people. And that didn't lower the crime rate because people were de-incentivized. It lowers the crime rate because they were just getting rid of a bunch of people, right? And so that doesn't really help.
I always say, people don't wake up.
El Salvador, not Ecuador. El Salvador.
People don't wake up one day and say, I want to live below the poverty line.
No, yeah.
I want to live with a mental health issue. That's just not the way those things happen. And I find with conservatism in general, that's it. You just need those one simple line answers. They don't want to delve deeper because of the pain they may be experiencing in trying to grow around some of the, as they unravel any indoctrination that may be incorrect, that they've been exposed to in their life. And everybody has to go through that journey, no matter what you grew up in. You're going to challenge what you grow up in, right? But to not be able to see the obvious in these kinds of things. I live in British Columbia. Mm-hmm. I worked in mental health, and I'm a social worker, and so I worked in that industry when the when deinstitutionalization happened. But more importantly, when the mental health system collapsed into our shelter care system.
Yeah.
And so when it was deinstitutionalized, some people who needed 24-hour supervision were put into community.
Yep.
With not enough resources, right? Yep. And believe me, to me, yes, there are the stories that hit the news, but it's more about, the poor, the individual that, leaves their home because there's no staff and they're standing in the middle of the road with their pants down and they don't even know or realize, because of maybe their IQ's below 70.
Yeah.
Or something like that. And how those people are not cared for anymore. And they're left to survive on our streets.
Yeah.
And we vilify the people on the streets so that we don't have to fund them to fix it. And there's where social work, there's where my foot lies, right? That's where I do the majority of my kind of cultural war conversation. Why I'm interested, why political is personal. Because I work with that personal piece, right? And I think a lot of people are so detached from that. And this existential threat that Canada has gone through, I think has put people in touch more with how the political really is personal.
Yeah, well, and actually touching base back to conservatives on that, you'll see the conservative base, and this is very observable, and especially if you have any training in any psychology, is the populace around Pierre is emotional.
Yes.
It's not logical. It's not numbers based. It's not data based. It is an emotional. And it's always like, oh, the liberals, they ruined us, blah, 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 blah. And it's like with no data, and it's entirely emotional. I've had plenty of people in my life reacting quite heavily. And I'm going, why are you emotional about this? And you can see the numbers for yourself. I can give you the numbers and you can actually read it for yourself. It's like you have a distrust, and this is a systemic failure we have in terms of disenfranchisement, where we don't, and I honestly have said this to a couple of people, we don't hold people accountable for their own actions, so they don't see that it can possibly be their fault. It's someone else's fault. It's always someone else's fault. And this is something that happens in mental health all the time. It's very easy to blame other people rather than look inward at yourself. Mm-hmm. And so people will go, well, I'm not earning a very good wage. I'm paying too much taxes. I don't have enough money in my pocket. And it's like, yeah, but you go buy 3 packs of cigarettes a day. You buy beer. You go out with your buddies. You bought a dirt bike and a quad. You're in debt for that. This isn't a governmental issue. This is a personal inward issue that you've overextended yourself part of that is psychology because we have the whole American dream thing still that happens even in Canada. So you can have all these things with no repercussions. But then that becomes a systemic failure where we haven't held these people accountable saying, this is your own fault, not the government. Because I've done this on my lives before going, what did they do to damage you? And they can never bring anything up.
Right.
Right. And I'll ask them, like, do you have a dirt bike? Do you have a new truck? How old is your truck? You know, do you have a snowmobile? Do you have this? Do you have that? What's your income? It's like, okay, you're living beyond your income. It's as simple as that. It's not because of taxation. The reality is we have average taxes for a G7 nation. We also have more services than a lot of those countries. So no, you're not getting taxed to death. This isn't the governmental issue. This is a systemic issue where you are no longer realizing that you can't live that way without consequence. And then because of that, they get disenfranchised because no one's telling them this. They believe it. They honestly believe the rhetoric because it supports their ideology that it's not their fault. And then it becomes an emotional issue. And it's not a logic. It's not a numbers issue. It's not a mathematics issue. It's not a policy issue anymore. It is an emotional issue for them.
Do you know what I find in living in northern British Columbia and having to work be surrounded sort of with the far right and separatist movement of the world that I personally lived in, is that the people who had success, like say under Harper, they had the good job, oil and gas, they did things, and they had all the toys, all the stabilized with finances. But because it happened to them, you think it happened to everybody.
Yeah.
But it didn't happen to everybody. And even those right around them, because they went to McDonald's, they went to the service industry pieces that their money or privilege allowed them to go to, but those people didn't share the same wealth, didn't share the same stability.
Yep.
And they couldn't see that, maybe it would be better to improve the life of everybody around them while their life improves. I think they should have a good life too. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. Everybody should have good access. I had a conversation with my father this morning, and he's 85. And, he sees the world changing from, let's say, a manufacturing, a job, 9 to 5, work, to a service industry type of work where people don't have to cook for themselves. They can just phone and they can have that service delivered for them, and that there's many kind of lost skills happening on a generational level because of the shift. Mm-hmm. And my conversation back was, well, as technology grows, as AI grows, the whole idea is to make it better for humans, to have a better quality of life. And he was upset because the Uber driver was making as much money as a tradesman, he said. And I'm like, well, I don't know if that's normalized. Maybe where you live, there's an Uber driver making that kind of money.
Yeah, that's a little high.
I don't think that's the way it applies overall.
Yeah.
And, so sometimes people grasp onto a good example of one success story and they think it's the same story for everybody. And I think that's a fault within the conservative movement in general, right? Anyway, I don't know why I went off on that tangent, but
I had someone in and they were talking about how their business has declined over the last 2 years and it was the fault of the Liberals. And I was going, well, no, because I'm in BC and my business, every business has declined over the last 2 years. Like we are entering a recession. That's just a fact. It's not a policy issue. I said, have you actually looked at other industries? Have you looked at the growth or the change or the financial disparity? And they hadn't. I said, okay, so immediately you made the assumption that because your business was declining, it must be a government principle. You didn't look outwards at the whole world. Going like, how is everyone else's business doing? Because if you literally went around to any business and asked them how you're doing over the last 2 years, everyone would have said it's slow. It's slow. Like everyone's been having this for the last 2 years because we are entering a period of recession. And that was, the fallout from COVID. We knew that was going to happen. That was likely to happen. It was predicted. It has happened. We have compounding issues now with the U.S. that's now going to make that into a great recession. And someone actually here saying generalizing from actual facts. I just want to check in there. So generalizations are a good way of outlining a higher level problem, a systemic problem. Yes, no one's going to 100% going to comply to that. No one's going to be 100% under that wing, but that is a vast majority of people. And I explained to this saying, BC, we don't complain about not getting equalization payments. However, we put in as much or quite often more tax dollars into the Canadian federal system than Alberta does. So why does Alberta complain so much more? And it's the radicalized ideology that, oh, the government's taking our money and they're giving equalization payments away. And that's the rhetoric that's been sold to them, that they are paying equalization payments, which is not true. All they do is pay federal taxes. The government then distributes those taxes accordingly. And part of one of the plans was going, well, there's a wealth disparity between the provinces. We want each province to have economic viability. So one way of doing that is having equalization payments. And that actually ends up having a trade multiplier effect. So if you end up giving someone $1,000, $1,200 ends up back in the economy effectively. Because quite often it involves goods from outside the country. It involves creating something that's used for sale and then generating more funds and more tax dollars. So it ends up benefiting everybody to have those things happen. And it's not like they're taking money from Alberta and just giving it to Ontario or giving it to Quebec. There's a structured reason behind it. But they haven't gone and learned about the structured reasoning. They just hear the part, get angry about it, and then go ahead and act on that anger.
You know, if you really want to find some sort of like industry trends and to get some good, concise information about it, is to engage in employment counseling. Because the government funds money and training to where they know the industries are going to be flourishing, where they know the need for workers is going to be, trades is going to be. You can see dollars opening up for trades and apprentices to get those houses built, right?
Yeah,
get the plumbers in there, get the electricians going.
They study the demand and they see where they can bring the supply. That's why we have a government to do this stuff for us, to help us out with it.
So we have somebody in the comments, and I want to give them some opportunity. They're mentioning the Arctic all the time, and none of it.
I can speak on the Arctic a bit, but I have to go to the bathroom. You pull them up.
Okay, yeah. I welcome you up into the box to ask some questions and have some conversation. Maybe you have some insight you can offer to us about that part of our beautiful country. My goal is to drive there. We have a long-term. We're not going to the United States for a vacation, but we want to drive up north all the way to Nunavut in the summer, of course. Anyway, we welcome you if you want to come and join the conversation. If not, when he comes back, I'll just ask if he can just generally talk or maybe say something more specific about what he might be knowing about going on in the Arctic. I myself, I don't have any sort of specific conversation or of study that I've done. I am worried, of course, about it because we've got Russia to the north of us and to it kind of surrounds the Arctic. So, but I don't feel like a threat of Russian invasion or anything. They're a little busy with Ukraine right now. However, I have heard the bigger conversation when you get into the psyche of these billionaires like Musk and Trump's father, having this sort of tech oligarchy.
Technocrats. Yeah, techno.
That it is somehow included Greenland, Canada, and the United States and Mexico as all being one big country, right? And so if the United States pulls out of supporting Ukraine, then it gives us more reason to feel threatened by what they could do up north. Gives the United States more of a reason to why they should govern. Anyway, that's just a thought. So Arctic Legacy, thank you for joining the conversation. And I'm eager to hear what your questions are and what you'd like to add to the conversation.
Hello. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Yeah, currently, well, if you want to talk about security, we had some conversations with our defense partners. First of all, I live in Iqaluit, Nunavut, originally from Thunder Bay, I'm sorry. Moved up here in 2014. Used to work for the government of Nunavut, then I thought better, and I jumped ship to the Inuit government, the regional. So Nunavut has a treaty between the feds and the Inuit, and the territorial-wide treaty organization is NTI, Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, and the organization that I work for is Kikitani Inuit Association. In that, we have surface and subsurface rights. and we negotiate with mines to set up trust funds that can then funnel royalties into social programming and such. So that's just a little bit about me. On Arctic security in 2006, you can find a CBC article about this. There were mysterious pingings coming up onto the sea ice from under the in the ocean around Igloolik, and the hunters that had found it had notified DFO and the Coast Guard, and we were told that it was most likely from a submarine. However, D&D notified us that there was nothing of Canadian origins in our waters at that time. So it just highlighted a risk that we don't know what is going on in our Arctic waters. And there was a general, he had retired not too long ago, but in one of our conversations with him, the Arctic is just too vast, and our capabilities are very limited. So in a security sense, that has been an issue, and we have a deep sea water port that's been ongoing construction in Qikiqtarjuaq for about 15 years since Harper was in power. But that has been stalled for quite some time. But the one in Iqaluit has been up and running, but they've had some issues. So just the infrastructure gap in Nunavut is just limiting. You can't drive to Nunavut. It's fly in, fly out. To fly to Iqaluit, it's about $1,500 on a good day. On a bad day, if you're trying to get it within a week or 2 weeks, you're looking at maybe 2,000, depending. If you're trying to go up to the communities, there's flights maybe once a week, and that's because there was a merger of the two northern airlines, and the Competition Bureau allowed it, even though they stated that there is no market for airlines in the north, which kind of signals to me and many others in Nunavut that it should be nationalized. So we have a problem in Nunavut where monopolies kind of reign.
Okay.
There was a professor at U of T that studied our Nutrition North program that's supposed to reduce prices of groceries, but the feds had turned the program, rather than giving the subsidies to airlines or whatnot, they gave it directly to the grocery stores. And what the U of T professor found is that the grocery stores aren't actually using it to bring down prices. Instead, they price adjust. So, and it's only one grocery store, Northmart. We do have co-ops, but they're not real co-ops. They're co-ops for Winnipeg, so Winnipeg people get the benefits of the co-ops in the Arctic. So it's
So there's got to be an economic driver up there in the north. But what is the economic driver? Maybe
government.
or where?
Yeah, so
So this is really interesting because when I moved up here, we started talking about terms that I haven't heard about since university. And we were talking about how do we transfer over into the wage economy? Because Nunavut is the world's largest hunter and gathering society, still to this day. And that conversation of transferring over to the wage economy hasn't really been talked about since the first or second industrial revolution. So the conversations that we're having up here in Nunavut are nation building questions.
Yeah.
And that idea of nation building and grand national projects died in the 70s and the 80s for P3 projects, but now we don't even get to do P3 projects in Nunavut. So the biggest economic driver is government. We do have a couple of mines here and there, but they mainly hire Southerners from Quebec or Ontario or Alberta.
Ontario.
and they, well, I'm originally from there ever since Doug Ford. Anyway, so we have these man camps that don't really transfer into local economic drivers, but it does somehow add to the GDP. But I know through our negotiations, the mines have been pulling back on certain trainings, certain certain points in our contract. We call it IIBA, Inuit Impact Benefit Agreements, and we have to constantly sue them or bring them to court. And it really puts a drain on our organization because we're a non-for-profit Indigenous governing body with charitable donee status. Very unique in the country. That's what the CRA lists us as. But we don't have an open budget to litigate. And that's what we have been doing, both with the DFO to try to regain our licenses for commercial fisheries. It's every step of the way, even in the child welfare side. Nunavut has, from the 2023 Auditor General report on the state of child welfare in Nunavut, they considered it a crisis. So, okay, we have Bill C-92 in place right now, which is an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children and family. That act, which was challenged by Quebec over jurisdictional issues, gave Indigenous governing bodies legislative authority, federal legislative authority, over their children. Nunavut, however, the children are apprehended, sent down south, and we're calling it 60 Scoop 2.0.
Right. I was just
So we're
sounds like six.
so
Sounds like that.
every step of the way, whether it's social, whether it's economic, it's a slog, it's a fight. In the housing side, just to build one house is about 1.5 million. Because all the products, all the steel, all the wood, everything has to be brought up north on sea lift. And we have pilings that have to go into the ground, that go into bedrock to support the house because of the shifting permafrost. We only have one company in all of Nunavut, Canadrill, that does the pilings, and they charge about something absurd like 10,000 per pile. So it's wherever we try to work on the infrastructure gap, on the social gap, services gap, on the healthcare gap, it's always litigation. It's always just trying to build and then litigate and try to get some sort of funding to then build those services. So I just want to hear from Path to Where what you know about the economics of Nunavut and what you can, I don't want to say recommend, but
So
I don't know if there are solutions, but I just want to get your pick your brain.
yeah, so I was up there 2008, 2009. I was in the Arctic, and that actually first spurred my interest in how Arctic communities actually survive. Because I went up there and went, how is this sustainable? There to me didn't seem to be any reason for it to be sustainable. And this is where people, I've said this before, and it's a rather divisive topic, is that any northern communities are systemic failures, effectively. They cannot support themselves.
Yes.
It's impossible. That's why everything's so expensive, right? There's no interest for a company to go and do work up there unless they make.
Do you want to know the history?
What?
Sorry to cut you off. We did, so our organization did the Kikitani Truth Commission, which is the world's second Indigenous-led truth commission after South Africa. And in that report, we talked about community histories, and the federal government forcibly relocated Inuit and took them, forcibly slaughtered their dogs and forced them into communities in the name of Arctic sovereignty. So they were human flagpoles.
Yeah.
So this is why these communities are created. But at the same time, any conversation about, because there's a couple of conservative whack jobs that talk about relocating communities like it was Newfoundland in the 60s. But in the 60s, Inuit were being forcibly relocated and settled into communities. So we're here because of Arctic sovereignty, because we wanted to push the Americans out, because we were going to lose it if we didn't. And that's in our report as well. And so these communities kind of are forced to be defunct. Like they're set up to fail by the federal government and through decades of inaction and funding.
Well, okay, so here's where I'm going to argue a little bit against that, because there is no economy that can sustain what is happening up there. So they can't have
Exactly.
There's nothing the Inuit can do to create an economy because they were a nomadic people, right? So what you've done is you've taken a nomadic culture, put them into a first world Western situation, which no one's going to divest from that. No one's going to take themselves out of that and go, yeah, we're going to go back to living in igloos. That's just not going to happen. And so we have to acknowledge the fact that if you are going to live that type of lifestyle, this type of environment, this type of ideology,
your mic is a bit low too. I'm not sure.
Sorry, I'll get a little closer. So if you are wanting to live this lifestyle, have these things, have this type of culture, this society, this nation, it is fundamentally systematically flawed. And there's nothing you can do to fix that. There is no
Exactly.
Well, but this is the thing. Like, there is no reason for those communities to exist in the Arctic anymore as they actually exist, because those communities can exist anywhere else in Canada and still have and actually have more economic benefit from it. The problem is they are not sustainable because there is no economy that can be created for them. Right? You're talking about, even Arctic shipping. I've touched on this in the past. There's only like a 3-month window where that's even possible. Right, because the ice packs and the currents and the winds all moving the ice packs around. So we can't have a sustainable year-round economy. They're entirely reliant on life support, effectively. So getting oil barges up there for heat over winter. I'm sure you've dealt with that. They need to get fuel barges up there, and you get fuel trucks up there to actually give people oil or propane or whatever type of heat source they're using. Because there's no trees around to burn, right? It's the Arctic.
Diesel.
Yeah, exactly. So
they're all diesel plants.
Yep. And so that's the thing is these are constantly on life support to support a community that doesn't have an economy. There isn't a solution to that because it just doesn't exist, right? The only thing that could drive it is economic benefit in terms of mining of some type. That is literally all that can happen in the Arctic for economic benefit. Because it's frozen for 9 months out of the year, right? There isn't a sustainable fisheries. There isn't sustainable forestry. There isn't any industry that can be utilized to help those communities grow. So they will be indefinitely on life support from the government, and that is why the relocation idea has been thrown so many times, because you're talking about a very small number of people that are constantly having to deal with issues that are first world issues in a third world environment. And this is the thing; it's not
exactly
the environment they're in. And so how do you sustain that long run? It's not. That's why the flights are so expensive, because they're not economically viable. That's why getting materials up there, because it's not economically viable. On a basic economic principle, they are doomed, right? So what do we do? Do we say, okay, we are going to indefinitely fund these communities, and we know that they're going to need this much funding per year, and it's just going to be tax dollars put into it, because that's all that we can do. Because it doesn't matter what plan you have for economic growth, there isn't an economy, right? There isn't something they can do in terms of economics to grow, to sustain. That's why they're all on a decline, right? That's the unfortunate thing. Since they did get pushed into the situation, since the situation now exists, and no one's going to go back to the way they lived before. Now, what do we do to move forwards? Do we gradually move the population? Because I'm sure a lot of people from the north end up moving away, just like small towns in Nova Scotia that used to be coal towns.
Yeah.
Right. The population ends up slowly divesting themselves from the environment they were in to more sustainable economic environments. So what do we do? Do we let that be a natural process, or do we continue to sustain communities that they themselves know are not economically viable?
So do you think there's a military purpose in sustaining these communities that minimalist levels for the government so that if something was to happen on a security level up north, they'd have a place to launch. They'd
Well,
have a place to, like, could they build a base there? Could they, you know?
that's the thing. We could build a base up there, but most military bases are self-sustaining. Right. So whatever's on the base is what they need, and they get everything flowing in, trucked in, shipped in. So they don't necessarily need a community to support them.
Okay.
Yeah, they don't interact with the community
No, go look
because
at
we have
around
yeah,
the world.
we have
they have
DF
McDonald's and like Tim Hortons, and like they have all the stuff in the base. Right.
now. Path to Nowhere. I will say we did do a signing with the federal government not too long ago on our SINA, SINAA. It's a Inuktitut word about ice. Anyway, that agreement is our blue economy vision, commercial fisheries, inshore, offshore, consolidating that. We had to sue DFO because they gave our fishery licenses to Nova Scotia, our adjacent water, which went against the Nunavut Agreement, the treaty. So we won on that, and in our SINA agreement, we're also looking at expanding our Nautisuktik program, which is our land steward program. And what they do is they, besides doing monitoring and research, they also are full-time hunters that go out on the land, do their catch, subsistent, and then come back to the community and give out. Also added to that is the fisheries as well as our blue economy, which is looking at different ways to economic opportunities of Arctic sea lane shipping and different ways we can produce some sort of economy out of our oceans. So like tidal wave energy, tidal wave and what is that called? Tidal wave. We're looking at building a hydroelectric dam. I don't know why, but we are just close to Iqaluit. And there's other projects in the works too, but I'm of the opinion that it's not going to be enough to actually sustain
No.
Nunavut itself.
Because you're talking about a small season of what, Arctic char probably, a few deep water species, halibut, cod, stuff like that you could possibly catch. But again, small period of time where
Beluga, narwhal, yeah.
Yeah, but those aren't world market things, right? You're not going to be able to sell that stuff on the world market in any substantial quantity.
No.
So that's not an economically viable thing to do. You're just internally consuming that, so it doesn't actually bring in any revenue. You have to look at what can bring in external revenue. You can't just rely on internal turnover, because there's always depreciation in internal turnover. United States.
And it comes back to mining.
Yeah,
which-
back to mining.
In our conversations with communities, there's big time concern. Just how certain mines, there was De Beers, they were in the Kivalliq now, but you guys might know it as Keewatin. And they kind of just basically effed over the community, and they had no clue. They were thinking Canada is a first world nation, and then when they got to Nunavut, they realized, oh, this is like the Congo in terms of living standards. And they just didn't know how to work it in a Canadian context. And then on our side in the Eastern Arctic, we have a couple of, we had to kick out the Chinese and Russians. CSIS came to us and told us that, and we're like, okay. But investment into the Arctic for mining, we have uranium, we have rare earths, we have like cobalt, lithium, diamonds, oil, but there's also the huge economic impact. And we have the regulations in place because of the treaty, and we don't want to get rid of them. But I know through our work with Baffinland that they try to skirt and try to even, what do you call that? Make backroom deals with people that sit on the PGs, the public government institutions that oversee the the regulations. Yeah, and it's soured the taste of Inuit, and they don't trust mining corporations for good reason. So even in that sense, when we look at mining as a solution, it's not to Inuit. So we're then put into a catch-22 of like, how do you have economic drivers to support community?
Even in terms of mining, the problem is whether or not it is considered ore, and ore is whatever is mineable in a quantity that you can make a profit off of it. So like uranium in the north probably wouldn't be worth it because uranium is relatively low distribution in over large areas, so you actually have to turn over a lot of material to get enough of it. And in the Arctic, that's a very big challenge for obvious reasons. This is why like the diamond mines prevail because the profit margin is fairly high on that. So the ore is relatively good, right? The quality of ore is relatively good for the return. But when you start looking at rare earth elements where you're talking about a very small percentage in terms of percent per ton, where you have to turn over a lot of tonnage in a very hostile environment, that makes it very difficult for them to turn a profit, which is why they try to do these backdoor deals, like these backroom closed door deals, because they need to find some economic benefit to make it sustainable for them. So yeah, that sows distrust because you're going, well, why are you doing this? Why aren't you bringing it out in the open? And they're going, well, like we know we have to bring in labor from like these really trained guys from say Serbia, just for example, that they are really proficient in mining and they'll work for cheap, right? We have to bring in them to make it economically viable. So we need some type of agreement to do that. I'm not saying they're doing that, but this is the type of stuff that happens. So,
well, and this is the funny thing, because in our treaty, in the Nunavut Agreement, there's a affirmative action piece that 85%, so a representative workforce. So the idea is that we're supposed to train and uplift Inuit into these positions. But the mines don't do that. The GM, the government of Nunavut, doesn't do that. A lot of local businesses don't do that. And there's a lot of old school racism.
well, I can actually touch on that on terms of an economics, in terms of a mathematics point of view. They'll look at a community of 1,000 people and going, how many people can we train in this community that are going to be proficient? When we pull from a talent pool of 100,000 people, and then we hire 100 people out of that 100,000, right? So in terms of as a business principle of things, it's a really risky thing for them to do, even if they go ahead and train people, because you can train 100 people. Whether or not those 100 people are going to actually be proficient and good employees is completely different from whether or not you can pull all the good employees you need from a population of 1 million people or 2 million people, right? Companies are only ever going to do what's in the best interest of them and their operations.
Exactly.
Right. So it's not just a cultural thing. This is a basic business economics. And this goes into the whole DEI hiring policy stuff, right? Where people are going, well, why are we going to do DEI? We might not get the best people. And it's like on a global scale, when you pull talent pools, it's very different than when you pull talent pools. So,
but it's funny because they're legally obligated under the treaty.
Yeah.
So it leads to precarious situations. Like, and I keep thinking back to like, is Nunavut internal colony or is it rentier capitalism?
Yeah.
So on Monday nights we have Indigenous Matters. I don't know if you know that show or not. Treaty 6, who's sat on many negotiating, sat at many negotiating tables for different treaties. I know she would really celebrate the conversation. I just want to drop that before, anything happens and I lose you in this conversation or whatever. Because I find it interesting. I find it, mathematically speaking, what you're talking about with this DEI conversation, you can go and train people within that community, but what happens if they leave and then who's going to replace? So all the economics in this stuff, it just falls apart. So
it makes it high risk for them and they don't want a high risk environment.
So the question is, why is the government maintaining at the rate they are? Mm-hmm. Like what is the goal of long term? Is this how are they going to manage this? You've said you might be asking an elephant to climb a tree here and asking industry to come in and overcome the problems that Path to Where has been kind of highlighting here. So is there a flaw in, like you said, there's what was the phrase you just used? There's a clause in your treaty agreement that kind of demands that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and, you know, so maybe that needs to be revisited somehow. I have no,
But
actually
even-
have no idea how to respond.
Even the reasoning behind that, so even if they do include the entire community and the primary source of employment is from that community, there's a good chance that if there's a downturn in that mine, all those people are going to now leave the community to go get jobs because now they're well trained, right? They're making a good income. They have disposable income. So are they going to stay there and just let their income just, whittle away? Or are they going to go, I'm well trained in this now. There's a mine down here hiring. I'll go move down there to get employment. And then the community shrinks, right? Which is what happens.
What we're seeing actually is more of a brain drain from Iqaluit to Ottawa, not from the communities.
Okay.
So even when there, only if it's like for medical or like giving birth, medical, people then go down south and then kind of get lost in the system. But for the most part, people want to stay in communities. People don't want to leave communities. And there's a huge pride of which community they come from. And there's dialects from each community. So it's
I would slightly argue
it
that.
doesn't follow the typical economic route where people think that labor moves from one place because there's a lack. No, it's actually people will just stay in the community if they lost the job.
I see.
Well, but the communities are shrinking constantly. Like the numbers have shown that. Unless
They're actually growing.
the community, the Inuit community, has typically been shrinking, and people have been moving into the area to support the economy because of the government initiatives.
Well, the birth rates are actually opposite.
Yeah.
So like Akviet, like the community of Akviet is more 2/3 underage, and their population keeps booming more so. But it's more of like the quote unquote city of Iqaluit, where people are actually, yeah.
Okay, so go look at the numbers in terms of like actual growth, typical growth rates, and then see what the Inuit are doing, and then you see the population change in terms of growth rate versus birth rate. Because I actually met someone, 10 years ago from Tuktoyaktuk, because I'd been up there, and I was like, I've been up there before, and he was a male model down here in Vancouver. And I was like, well, how many of you guys are actually leaving the community? Because when I was up there, it was only so big. And he said most of his generation were working on moving out of the region. Just a lot of them hadn't because they didn't have the financial means to do so. So there was a desire to do it in the millennial and after generation.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's not like it's not happening. And if you look at the trends, you go, okay, these should be paralleling, and they're not. So the communities on a whole aren't growing the way they should. And you do have divestment, which is the dangerous thing, because it's usually the people who are most intelligent, who have the most amount of skill, who are the ones who are getting out. And that then creates a brain drain and a talent drain from the community.
This
What we identified with ITK, sorry.
I only have the privilege of path to wear for a few more minutes, and so I have another burning question I wanted to ask him, and it isn't on topic, unfortunately, and I don't want to shut down this conversation either. And I maybe we could have it again in more detail on Indigenous matters if you're interested in the Monday night show, because we're just running out of time here, Arctic Legacy, and I just want to thank you for coming up and
Thank you.
making us be aware, because you know what, I've never talked about this part of Canada in our political conversations, and I think we need to do more we need to do more diligence on that. So with that, having said that, is there anything you'd like to wrap up with saying, Arctic Legacy?
No, I just want to thank you guys for having me. Yeah, and if more people bring up the Arctic and bring it just in general conversation, I believe, like for Nunavut, we need more exposure from the general southerner perspective, because not a lot of people are actually thinking about the Arctic.
I agree. I
So,
agree. 100%.
thank you.
Okay. All right. Path to where? is something that's kind of irked me since the Harper days was the FIPA agreement, the Foreign Investment Protection Act. How now I'm like, is that working in our favor now because of what's happening with these tariffs and the situation where the United States is no longer our best player?
Yeah. I'm looking to see, honestly, what Carney does exactly with that agreement. Because a lot of what we've done was to protect U.S. interest,
Yes.
not Canadian interests. And that's now obviously presented itself with a very severe challenge for us. It is something we can pivot away from, but it is very problematic. And like I've spoken many times in my lives that people are, fearful of China and fearful of Russia. And it's like, okay, Russia, I understand. But the reality is, so like China's tried investing several times in Canada, just like this guy here was just saying they had to get pushed out. And generally what they're doing is coming in and they're doing infrastructure projects in exchange for mineral rights or natural resources. But we've been limiting that on behalf of the US. And so I would like to see Mark Carney go look back at the last 20 years, because obviously he's been alive the last 20 years, of Canadian political initiatives in terms of trade, and go and specifically outline which ones were beneficial for Canadians versus which ones were not. Because the problem with a lot of this is, when I was doing research, was the research or the data isn't published. So we don't actually know what the economic gains or disparity was from those agreements. When I started looking into a lot of this, I went, oh, we only have a surface level of information. Beyond that, we're probably going to have to do a freedom of information request to get anything out of them. Because even like the Harper doing the closed door deal, none of us knew about that till afterwards. And none of us knew that he paid out the Catholic Church for the residential school stuff until after he was out of office. Right. And this becomes really problematic, which is why we have new acts for transparency that came into play through the Liberal government. Because, this has been done for a long time. And even look back as far as the Avro Arrow, right? That was canceled on behalf of the US to boost their contracts. So, Canada has played the cooperative little brother to the US for quite a long time. And it has economically sustained us, but did it actually work in our benefit in the long run? Probably not. So should these agreements exist anymore? Should they exist without, the Canadian public being, very aware of them and very aware how that's affecting them on, if they have their own business, if they're doing trade between provinces, if they're doing trade to the US, if they want to do trade with other nations. Because Canadians on a whole, despite the fact we're fairly well educated in terms of what happens in government, what acts are being passed. Of course, no one can keep track of all of that. It is a lot to keep track of. We just have to have faith in the fact that whoever we hired to do the job is doing the job.
Do you think the rise in the Chinese policing stations, which I understand have been legitimately organized political lobby kind of offices underneath the FIPA agreement to make sure that they have boots on the ground, and then they morph into these Chinese policing systems? Is there truth in that? Is this just something, I don't talk about it much because I've never seen it never had it validated in a good way.
Talking about the Chinese surveillance and police stations here in Canada.
Yeah.
I always like to, I hear this in people, I go to like, are you really surprised? Because the US has been doing that since the 50s. The UK has done it, right? Every major country, Russia's done it. Like Russia has probably upwards of 1,000 agents in the United States, right? So this is nothing new. Governments have been doing this forever. Canada as a whole hasn't really done it. We don't have any reason to be doing it. But all these countries with majorly growing economies, massive populations, and massive wealth to protect have been doing this consistently. Mm-hmm. So the fact it was brought into public view was not surprising, but the fact it was happening was also not surprising. Because the U.S.
It grew under this FIPA agreement. Do you think that somehow, plays to the evolution to the point where we have to talk about it now?
Yes, because what you'll more than likely have is sharing of information agreements. And that's already been happening for the last 10 years, where we start sharing information country to country, Five Eyes stuff, so that we're not in the dark, so that they don't have to have stations in our country to get the information they need. Now, the Chinese government, people are saying they're overstepping with what they're doing, trying to find people who are Chinese nationals in Canada and to bring them back to China. But the US does that all the time too, right? People don't hear about it because they're just generally good at keeping it secret. But there's plenty of information out there about how they've done that over the decades, over the last 50, 60 years, continuously, and influencing stuff on a very dramatic scale, where it's like China is just starting to do this. They're literally just starting in the last 10, 15 years to do this stuff, where the US has been doing it for 40, 50 years. But everyone just trusts the US, right? Despite the fact they're actually the ones going around causing the conflicts. They're the ones causing the problems. In this instance, this was what happened in Canada. This was them trying to deal with domestic problems that were transferred overseas. And that was something we hadn't seen from them before, which was concerning, right? But in reality, they are doing what most major countries have already been doing. So they just joined that race. It's really unfortunate because like Indian government's doing the same thing. Like they're getting caught doing the same thing here in Canada. And so now we really have to be aware that we are in a global situation now. We are not in a national situation. We because of information superhighway, because of our ease of transport, our ease of travel around the world, we are no longer isolated on an island, right? Global issues from other countries are going to come into our country, and we are going to have to find ways of dealing with that in ways that they don't have to then think that they need to have a police station in our country to deal with that. Extradition treaties are always a big thing, where it's like, okay, we're going to tell you, we have this person that's wanted under these criminal charges. Here are the reasons we need you to look at it. So the Huawei executive thing is a good example of that.
Just ran through my head. Ran through my head, yeah.
So the U.S. came and asked us to arrest them without a case at hand, right? And then we were responsible for building the case and ended up falling apart. And it's like, you can't do that, right? You can't ask another country to have actions on behalf of you legally without having their case prepared, right? This was a knee-jerk reaction they had. They were like, oh my God, she's in the country, quickly grab her, right? Without having a plan in place, which is the worst thing you can do. If you've ever had any type of a legal case, the worst thing you can do is have a legal case without having a plan. Right?
As conservatives right now.
Without any plan at all is the worst thing you could possibly do, which is what they did. And it ended up being a detriment to Canada because we had Michael Savor and what's his face being held, and it was just a retaliation tactic, and it becomes an international incident when it didn't need to be. And again, this is our actions on behalf of the U.S., right? And more often than not, we're getting ourselves in hot water because of that.
Yeah, so the NAFTA agreement, or the new CUSMA,
yeah,
pronounced. There's everybody's come to an agreement on where the disputes are going to be resolved.
Yeah.
So the special courts are going to set up and have eyes on whatever the disagreement is. Yeah. And I don't know. I know that they have taken like the softwood lumber dispute to this place, and the United States just ignores the rulings, right? And so with China, and so correct me if I'm wrong, all of the disagreements have to happen like in the Chinese courts, like not in Canadian courts.
Yes, well, so here's the problem, right? Every country wants it done in their own court system for fairness, and this is kind of an argument for having an internationally recognized court outside of like international criminal courts, an international court that all the countries sign on to, where we take all of our laws, we find a unified agreement over it, so that we can have these disputes. Right, so that we can do this, this is the problem. Now you're in posturing, right? Well, we're going to do it in my house. Now we're going to do it in my house. Now we're going to do it in my house. How do you deal with that? That can come down to negotiations in terms of economics going forward. Going like, okay, well, we'll agree to do this on your grounds. Here are the terms we have to agree to. Here's a legal structure we have to agree to, and if we do that, we'll continue to do this, right? This trade agreement, and this is where like all this leveraging comes in. It's not just a one-sided thing. It's not just a legal court battle. It can be a whole economic structure battle, which is what's going to have to happen. Like China has been known for violating IP rights for decades. Are we going to be able to stop them? Nope, because there's no means that we can do that. So what do? You come to some terms of agreement going like, okay, so if you guys are going to keep doing this, we're going to have to find some way of financially making it unreasonable for you to do it. Right? Or how about we come to an agreement where you stop violating IP rights, but we'll start introducing buying technology and we start working out trade agreements. Right? So you're telling we can grow from it.
And that's where I hope, Mark, like you were saying, I wonder what Mark Carney's going to do with this particular trade agreement moving forward, because he seems like he knows how to protect Canada really well economically.
Yeah, he does.
So for people like you, I'm noting the time. So for people like you being on TikTok, I appreciate being able to come to find a credible source to explain the information for, Mr. Global is another person that I turn to for credible information from somebody who's worked within industry, who's motivated by who analyzes analytically, is able to transfer those skills into another conversation, but coming here and platforming yourself on TikTok, I think is important because as I explained to my 85-year-old father today, majority of the world is not watching CBC and CTV. They're in TikTok, they're in Twitch, they are in Substack, they are in Discord. And of course he knows none of these names.
Yeah.
Right? But this is where the message needs to be said. Yeah. And so I want to thank you for your time today. And come on my little show in the afternoon here on the Beaver Network, Finding Your Own Damn Way. Is there any last thoughts you'd like to share before we just sort of wrap it up?
Everybody who talks to me about thanking me for doing this, I generally want everyone to go out and find the numbers for themselves. The reason I publish what I do and I put out all of my resources is so that people can see it and know that they can themselves go do it. Right. Because I never intended to do this. This was never what I wanted to do. This was not on my bucket list. This is not in my 2025 plans. It came literally from one video and someone saying, hey, I really like the way you explained it. Can you now explain this? And that precipitated this whole thing. And to me, I went, what we have as a problem is that people aren't taking the time to do the reading. And that's the difficult part. And people don't have time. So the best I can do is actually try to bring as much of actual factual information forward. But I encourage anybody, if they ever see anything of mine and their brain gets tickled by it, go spend an hour doing a bit of research on it. Make yourself more informed, because these are all standard economic principles. These are all numbers you can find online. These are all known economic theories. I'm not in an economic field, but it wasn't a difficult thing to learn. Because it is just math-based, it is just predictability trends, and a lot of the theories aren't particularly complex. If you go down to a stock market level and start reading that stuff, your brain is going to start spinning. I don't recommend that. I do recommend looking at the macroeconomics, the big picture stuff, what makes a difference, so that you can be prepared for the future, what's going to happen. We are in a really complex time where there's so many things happening at once, it's very difficult to figure out what's happening. But the best thing you can do is every night spend 20 minutes, find a topic, read a bit about it, become better informed. Because I don't plan on doing this indefinitely. I mean, last week I was kind of like, I don't want to do this anymore because this is really tiring. So I can understand why people find it valuable. I will keep doing it, but at the same time, I would prefer that people become more educated on all of this themselves.
As we go through the recession and even your business is going to be hit, you can monetize. You can monetize.
I choose not to.
Where you do a lot of the monetizing and follow Tom Powell Jr. and Hawk and Mr. Global. You, sir, have an ability to do that. I could see that.
But I've specifically chosen not to. Same with the Lens app that we have going on. The reason I don't monetize myself even on Substack is because I don't want anyone to believe or have any reason to believe that I'm being influenced in any way, economically, by any means, or even influenced to be, a person who's being conspiracy theorist or pushing rhetoric or pushing fear mongering. I don't want that. I don't want people to think that or to even have any idea that I'm profiting off of this, because I'm not, and I don't want to.
How about selling your engineer skills? Now that you have to work the editing stuff on TikTok, it's pretty similar over on YouTube. Yeah, you go sell your yacht building stuff.
I actually shrunk my customer base because I wanted less stress in the last couple of years, but at the same time, overall, everything shrunk. We've seen businesses fail recently, so
no doubt.
Yeah, we're in a recession, believe it or not.
Thank you so much for your time today. You held the room strong with 50 people in here, with just us having conversation with a couple of people. Everybody's interested in listening to what you have to say. So thank you for sharing it on Finding Your Own Damn Way. And hope to see you in cyberspace in some more of the shows, okay?
All right.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye. All right. And thank you all for joining in. It was an exciting conversation, wasn't it? It was. See you all next time on Beaver Politics. Beaver Network.